This is a work of cinematic fiction created entirely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, organizations, and events are completely fictional. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. Grant Holloway set his coffee down on the kitchen counter, looked his wife of 20 years directly in the eye, and said it like he was closing a case. "You're not my wife anymore, Elena. I need you to understand that." No trembling, no hesitation. He straightened his cufflinks, the gold ones she had given him on their 15th anniversary, and picked up his phone as if the conversation was already over. Elena stood at the window overlooking the lake, the morning light cutting across the water in long silver lines. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply turned her face slightly toward the glass and let the silence answer for her, because some things don't require a response. They only require time. If this story already has your heart beating faster, you are exactly where you belong. Hit that like button right now. Drop your city or country in the comments. I read every single one, and I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next, because the stories we bring you don't stop at one surprise. They unravel, layer by layer, until everything you assume turns out to be wrong. Stay with us. Elena's story is just beginning. The Holloway marriage had looked from the outside like something out of a design magazine. The lake house sat on 4 private acres in the northern part of the county, tucked behind a long gravel driveway lined with white birch trees that Elena had planted herself the first autumn she owned the property. The main structure was 2 stories of pale stone and glass, designed with a restraint that made it feel permanent rather than merely expensive. A wide timber deck extended over the water on the eastern side, and on still mornings, the reflection of the house on the surface of the lake was so precise it looked like a second home sitting just beneath the world. People who visited for the first time almost always stopped talking when they first saw it. Not because it was showy, because it was exactly right. Grant had always accepted compliments about the house with a slight nod, as if acknowledging something he had built himself. He had a habit of placing his hand on surfaces when people admired them. The stone fireplace, the custom kitchen counter, the curved railing on the upper deck, as though confirming ownership through touch. Elena had noticed this for years. She had also never said a word about it, because she understood that some people needed the credit more than they needed the truth. And she had believed, for a long time, that loving someone meant making room for their smaller vanities. She had been wrong about a great many things where Grant was concerned. The morning he told her she was no longer his wife, he had been awake before dawn. Elena had heard him moving through the bedroom in the dark, careful and deliberate in the way people move when they've already made a decision they don't want to discuss. She had kept her eyes closed, not because she was asleep, but because she had known for several weeks that something was coming, and she had decided she would not chase it. She would let it arrive. Grant Holloway was 52 years old, gray at the temples in a way that photographed well, and had been the senior partner at Holloway & Fitch for 11 years. He had a reputation in the county's legal community that he maintained with the same disciplined attention he gave his appearance, carefully, consistently, and with a sharp awareness of who was watching. He won cases because he was genuinely intelligent. He kept winning because he understood how to perform confidence in rooms full of people who mistook performance for substance. He had met Elena at a gallery opening 23 years ago. She had been 31, recently returned from 4 years working in Europe, and she had a stillness about her that he had found initially slightly unnerving. He was used to women who responded to him quickly, with laughter, with attention, with the small adjustments people make when they want to be liked. Elena had done none of those things. She had looked at the painting in front of her for a full 3 minutes before acknowledging he was standing beside her, and when she finally spoke, she said, "The proportions are wrong on the left side, but I think that's deliberate. I think that's actually the most interesting thing about it." He had been captivated immediately. They married 18 months later. Elena had told him, during their engagement, that she owned property, the lake house, which she had purchased at 28 with money from a combination of her architectural fees and a private investment she had made in her mid-20s that had grown more substantially than anyone had expected, including her. She had described it simply and factually, without drama. Grant had listened with the benign half-attention he gave to information that didn't directly require his participation. He had nodded, said it sounded lovely, and redirected the conversation to where they might honeymoon. What he had failed to understand, and would spend the next 2 decades failing to understand, was that the lake house was not simply property. It was the physical evidence of who Elena had been before him and who she had continued to be beside him, quietly and without announcement, through every year of their marriage. She had never stopped working. She consulted on private architectural projects under her maiden name, Brooks, and she had maintained a small but serious investment portfolio that she managed herself with the methodical patience of someone who had learned early on that wealth built slowly and without spectacle was the only kind that actually held. Grant had known this in the abstract. He had never been interested in the specifics. His own income was substantial, and he had spent it with the assumption that abundance was a permanent condition rather than something that required maintenance. They had not been unhappy, exactly. Or perhaps they had been unhappy in the way that certain long-term situations become. Gradually, incrementally, in such small degrees that the shift is invisible until you try to remember what comfortable had felt like and realize you can't. Elena had tried, at various points, to be more direct with him about what she needed. More presence, more curiosity about her life, her work, her private world. She had not been dramatic about it. She had raised the subject clearly, more than once, and Grant had always responded with the particular brand of sincerity that lawyers develop, present enough to seem engaged, slippery enough to avoid commitment. He was sorry she felt that way. He would do better. Things had been very busy at the firm. She understood how demanding that world was. She did understand. That was part of the problem. The woman he had been seeing for 8 months was named Celeste Varon, a 37-year-old associate at a competing firm who had initially approached him at a bar association dinner and whose admiration for him had been so uncomplicated and so freely offered that Grant had found it, in his own private accounting, almost medicinal. He told himself it was not what it appeared to be for approximately 3 months. Then he stopped telling himself anything and simply allowed it to continue. Elena had known about Celeste since the 5th month. She had not confronted him. She had spent the following 3 months reviewing documents, speaking with her attorney, and making quiet, precise arrangements. And she had waited, because she had learned long ago that the most powerful position in any situation is the one you occupy when the other person believes they have already won. The morning Grant told her she was no longer his wife, he had his overnight bag already packed and sitting by the front door. "I think we both know this has been over for a long time," he said. He was standing in the kitchen doorway, and his voice had the flat, reasonable tone he used in depositions. "There's no point in drawing it out." Elena turned from the window. She was wearing a gray linen shirt, and her hair was still loose around her shoulders. She looked at him for a moment without speaking, and Grant shifted his weight slightly, because her silence had always cost him more than her words. "You've been planning this for a while," she said. Not a question. "I think a clean break is better for both of us. Is Celeste moving in with you?" Something crossed his face, not guilt, quite, more like irritation at being seen. "I'm not going to get into that right now. I'm not asking you to." She walked to the counter and poured herself a second cup of coffee. "Where are you planning to stay?" "I'll get an apartment in the city. I'll be in touch with my attorney about the details." "Your attorney," she repeated. "Elena, I don't want this to become adversarial." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "I don't either, Grant." He picked up his bag. He seemed to be waiting for something, for her voice to break perhaps, or for her to reach for him, to produce some evidence that what he was doing had cost him something. She gave him nothing. She stood in her kitchen, in her gray linen shirt, and she watched him, and the silence between them was not hostile, but it was absolute. "I'll call you in a few days," he said. "Take care of yourself," she said. He left. The gravel popped under his car tires as he went down the long driveway, and then the birch trees swallowed the sound, and the house settled back into its own quiet, as it always had. Elena set down her coffee. She picked up her phone and called a number she had saved 3 weeks ago. "Marcus," she said, when the estate manager answered. "He just left. Go ahead and reset the gate codes, and please call the locksmith for the secondary entrance today, not tomorrow." "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said. "Already have him on standby." "Thank you." She paused. "And Marcus, nobody comes through that gate without my direct authorization. No exceptions." "Understood." She ended the call and stood at the window for a long time, watching the lake. Grant Holloway had spent the better part of 3 decades understanding how rooms worked. He understood power dynamics and the architecture of negotiation, and he was very good at reading the precise moment when the other party had decided to fold. It was perhaps this skill, refined to the point of instinct, that had made him so completely blind to the possibility that Elena had been doing the same thing to him, reading him, patiently and accurately, for years. He spent the first 2 nights after leaving in a hotel in the city, and then he moved into Celeste's apartment on a temporary basis, which Celeste had agreed to with enthusiasm, and which Grant had accepted with the private understanding that enthusiasm at the beginning of a situation was rarely a reliable indicator of its eventual quality. He was not, despite everything, a man without feeling. He missed the lake house that first week in ways he hadn't anticipated. The specific quality of the light in the morning, the sound of the water, the weight of the air in the rooms he had moved through for 20 years. He told himself this was natural. He told himself he would buy something comparable. He told himself a great many things in the first 10 days, and most of them were directed at the same basic project, the management of a discomfort he couldn't quite name. On the 11th day, he drove back. He told himself it was to collect some books he'd left and a specific blazer from the upstairs closet. But the truth, which he would not have admitted to anyone, including himself, was simpler. He wanted to walk back into that house. He wanted to feel it around him again and confirm, in some physical way, that it remained accessible, that it was still part of the life that was his. The gate was a black iron structure, 12 feet across, installed at the foot of the driveway where it met the county road. Grant had a remote in his car that had opened it, without exception, for 17 years. He pressed the button as he turned off the county road onto the gravel approach. The gate did not move. He pressed the button again. Nothing. He got out of the car, which was an instinctive and slightly ridiculous response to a malfunctioning gate, and stood in the gravel looking at it. The gate looked exactly as it always had, solid and cold and entirely uninterested in his inconvenience. He called Elena's cell phone. She answered on the third ring. "Grant?" "The gate isn't working," he said. A brief pause. "The gate is working fine." He processed this. "My remote isn't opening it." "I know, the codes were changed." "Elena, you said you were leaving," she said. Her voice was entirely even. "You left. The house is mine, Grant. The gate codes are mine to set. I have things inside. I need to get my... Make a list of what you need and have your attorney send it to mine. We can arrange a supervised collection of your personal belongings." A supervised? He stopped himself. He could feel the temperature of his own reaction rising in a way that he knew, professionally, was counterproductive, but that he was finding difficult to regulate. "This is my home." "Actually," Elena said, and her voice remained so completely steady that it was almost worse than anger would have been. "It's not. It never was. Take care of yourself, Grant." She ended the call. Grant stood at his locked gate in the gray afternoon light, the birch trees standing very still on either side of the driveway, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt like a man who had miscalculated. He got back in his car and sat for a moment with the engine idling. Then he pulled out and drove back toward the city, and he spent the entire drive thinking about what he owned and what he could prove and how quickly he could get his legal team assembled, because Grant Holloway was, first and always, a man who responded to problems by calculating his next move. He did not yet understand that the calculation was already over. Margaret Fitch had been Grant's law partner for 14 years, and the closest thing he had to a genuine friend inside the profession. She was 61, methodical in ways that were occasionally exhausting, and she had an almost physical discomfort with imprecision that made her, in Grant's estimation, the best contract attorney in the state. She also had the specific and inconvenient quality of saying true things to him that he did not want to hear. He told her about the gate situation the following morning over coffee in her office, framing it as a legal problem, which he genuinely believed it was, and she listened to the entire account without interrupting, which was itself a form of warning, because Margaret almost always interrupted. When he finished, she set her cup down and folded her hands. "How long has Elena owned the lake house?" she said. "She owned it before we got married. We talked about it. I was on the title." "Were you on the title?" He paused. Yes. I'm certain we..." He stopped again, because somewhere in the architecture of his certainty, something small and structural had begun to give way. "I assumed we were both on the title." "You assumed?" We lived there together for 20 years, Margaret. Living somewhere and owning it are different things. She looked at him steadily. Have you actually seen the deed? He had not seen the deed. He was aware of this with a new and unpleasant clarity. I need you to pull the property records, he said. Margaret was already reaching for her computer. Give me a few minutes. The county property records were public. Margaret pulled them up without difficulty, and they both sat in the pale fluorescent light of her office, looking at the screen. The lake estate at Birchwood Road, all 4 acres and the main house and the boathouse and the dock, registered to Elena Marin Brooks. Filing date, April 14, 11 years before Elena and Grant had married. Transfer history, none. Grant looked at the screen for a long time without speaking. She never added you, Margaret said. Not unkindly, just accurately. I need to understand what that means for the divorce proceedings. Margaret leaned back. Grant, if the property predates the marriage and she's never transferred any portion of it to marital ownership, and there's no cohabitation agreement that created an ownership interest, what about improvements we made? We renovated the east wing. We added the deck. Did you pay for those personally, or did the money come from joint accounts? He thought about it. Some from joint accounts, some from... He stopped, because he was remembering now that Elena had insisted on funding the major renovation herself, and that he had let her, with the privately comfortable logic that it didn't matter whose money it was when you were married, which had seemed reasonable at the time, and now had a different quality entirely. I need to look at all of it, he said. Yes, Margaret said, you do. She looked at him with an expression that was not quite sympathy, but was not its absence either. Grant, I've known you a long time. I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight. Go ahead. Did you ever actually pay attention to Elena's financial situation? Not broadly, specifically. Did you know what she had, what she owned, what she was managing? The honest answer arrived before he could shape it into something more tolerable. No, he said, not specifically. Margaret nodded as though this confirmed something she had already suspected. Then there may be things in those records that are going to surprise you. He drove home, to Celeste's apartment, which he had begun thinking of as home in the way you begin thinking of a waiting room as home when your stay extends beyond what you planned. And he sat at the small kitchen table while Celeste made dinner and spoke to him about her day. And he half listened and half thought about the deed and the renovation and the 20 years of assumptions he had stacked, one on top of the other, like a structure built on ground he had never tested. Somewhere along the driveway of the lake house at that moment, the birch trees he had lived among for 2 decades stood in the dark and felt no particular way about it. They were simply there, as they had always been, growing on ground that had never belonged to him. Elena received the first formal legal communication from Grant's attorney on a Wednesday morning, 9 days after the gate incident. Her own attorney, a woman named Patricia Sue, who specialized in high-asset divorce, and had the pleasant manner and absolute titanium spine of someone who had spent 20 years in courtrooms, called her immediately. They're claiming a marital interest in the property based on cohabitation and joint contribution to property improvements, Patricia said. Standard opening position. They're going to go wide and see what holds. What do you need from me? Everything you have. Original purchase documents, your financial records from before the marriage, records of every improvement made to the property, and how it was funded, your investment portfolio documentation, the trust documents. I have all of it, Elena said. I've had it organized for about 6 weeks. A brief pause on the line. You've been ready for this for 6 weeks. I've been ready for this for longer than that, Elena said. I just needed to wait for him to make the first move. Another pause. Elena, I've been doing this for 20 years. I want you to know that the position you're in is genuinely strong. But I also want to be honest with you. He's going to push hard because that's who he is and that's what he knows how to do. This might get uncomfortable before it gets resolved. Elena looked out her window. The lake was still that morning, gray-green and completely flat, reflecting a pale and even sky. Patricia, she said, I've been uncomfortable for a long time. I'm very good at it by now. She arranged to send the documents that afternoon. All of them, organized, indexed, and cross-referenced with the precise architectural clarity of a woman who had spent decades building things that were meant to last. The lake house was quiet at the end of that first week without Grant. Elena made herself dinner and ate it on the deck as the sun went down over the water, turning the surface from silver to copper to a deep, flat gray. The birch trees at the end of the driveway were barely visible in the fading light, their white trunks standing pale against the dark. She was not happy, exactly. She was something more complex and harder to name. The specific feeling that arrives when something that has been wrong for a very long time finally stops pretending to be right. She washed her plate. She poured a glass of water. She went to bed in the house she had bought when she was 28 years old, in the room she had designed herself, in the life she had built with her own hands, and she slept the way you sleep when you have been holding something for a long time and have finally set it down. Outside, the lake held its breath, and the birch trees stood in the dark, and the gate at the end of the drive remained exactly where it was, locked, and hers, and not going anywhere. Patricia Sue had a conference room on the 14th floor of a building downtown that looked out over the river, and on the morning she spread Elena's documents across the long table. The water below was moving fast and brown from 2 days of rain upstream. Elena sat on one side of the table with her hands folded. Patricia sat across from her with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a yellow legal pad that was already half filled with notes, which said something about how thoroughly she had reviewed the material before Elena even arrived. "I want to go through this with you systematically," Patricia said, "because when we get into the discovery phase, Grant's team is going to come at this from every angle they can find, and I need to know that you understand every piece of what's in here before they start asking questions." "Ask me anything," Elena said. Patricia tapped the top document on the nearest stack. "The Lake House purchase, April 26 years ago. You were 28. 28 in 3 months. The purchase price was listed at $412,000. Where did that money come from?" Elena had told this story before, but she told it again without impatience, because she understood that precision mattered more than brevity in rooms like this one. She had graduated from architecture school at 23, worked 2 years at a firm in the city, then taken a position with a European design group that placed her in Milan for 18 months, and then Zurich for another 2 years. The European salary had been good, and she had lived carefully, not miserably, but without the casual expenditure that her colleagues had considered a professional obligation. She had saved, and she had also made a single significant investment at 25, in a private real estate development fund that a colleague's husband managed, that she had researched for 4 months before committing to, and that had returned over the following 3 years considerably more than she had put in. "How much more?" Patricia asked. "The initial investment was $40,000. The return over 3 years was approximately $230,000. Patricia wrote this down. "And you have documentation?" "I have everything. The original investment agreement, quarterly statements, the final distribution letter, the tax filings for each year." "Good." Patricia moved to the next stack. "The investment portfolio. Tell me about when this was established and how it grew." This was a longer story, and Elena told it the same way she had always managed the portfolio itself, methodically, without drama, tracking each decision back to a clear logic. She had opened the account at 26, before the real estate fund had finished distributing its returns, using money she had saved from her European salary. She had managed it herself, without a broker, which most people in her life had considered either eccentric or reckless, and which had turned out to be neither. She had not chased high-risk positions. She had been patient in a way that required a specific kind of temperament, the ability to watch something grow slowly and resist the impulse to interfere with it. By the time she married Grant, the portfolio was worth slightly under $900,000. Patricia looked up from her legal pad. "At 31. "Yes." "And Grant knew about this?" Elena considered the question honestly. "He knew I had investments. I told him that clearly. I don't believe he ever asked for specifics, and I didn't volunteer them in detail because it didn't seem necessary at the time. We weren't merging our finances. I kept my account separate, he kept his, and we maintained a joint account for household expenses." "Whose idea was that structure?" "Mine." Grant agreed without much discussion. He was earning well, I was earning well, and I think he found the arrangement practical without thinking too carefully about what it implied. What it implied, Patricia noted on her legal pad, was that there had never been a genuine commingling of assets. 2 people could share a house and a life and a checking account for household groceries without creating a legal entanglement in the assets each had brought separately to the arrangement. It was not technically a complicated situation. What made it complicated was the assumption Grant had operated under for 20 years. The comfortable, completely unexamined assumption that the abundance surrounding him was a joint creation, a product of the partnership, something he had participated in building. He had participated in consuming it. That was a different thing. I want to ask you something that's not strictly legal, Patricia said, setting her pen down. Elena waited. Did you know, when you married him, that this might matter someday? Did you keep the account separate deliberately, because you were protecting yourself? Elena was quiet for a moment. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to give it accurately. I kept them separate because I had built them myself and I understood them, and I was better at managing them than Grant would have been, she said. And because I had seen enough of how he related to money, his own money, other people's money, to know that what he earned, he spent, and what he valued, he spent on being seen spending it. I didn't want that near the things I had built. She paused. I didn't marry him expecting it to end, but I kept certain things mine because I understood myself well enough to know that I needed to have something that couldn't be taken. Patricia looked at her for a moment. Then she picked up her pen. All right, she said, let's keep going. They worked through the morning and into early afternoon. The investment portfolio, now worth considerably more than it had been when Elena married, documented in statements going back 26 years. The private architectural consulting work she had continued under her maiden name, with contracts and payment records and tax filings for every year. The family trust she had established 15 years ago, structured carefully with the help of an estate attorney she had chosen herself, that held a portion of her assets in a form that was entirely separate from any marital consideration. The renovation records for the lake house, which showed, line by line, that the major structural work, the east wing expansion, the full kitchen rebuild, the new roof on the boathouse, had been funded from Elena's personal accounts, not from any joint source. There were joint account contributions to the property, utilities, routine maintenance, landscaping, the painting of the exterior trim 6 years ago. Patricia added these up while Elena watched. Approximately $62,000 over 20 years, Patricia said, from joint accounts, which means Grant could reasonably claim contribution to half of that, $31,000, against a property currently valued at, Elena said, just over $3 million. Patricia finished. Yes. She took her glasses off and set them on the table. Elena, I want to be straightforward with you. Grant's team is going to work hard. He's a litigator. He knows how proceedings work. And he has every incentive to make this as broad and as aggressive as possible, because the only outcome that benefits him is one where a judge decides to look past the documentation and find some form of equitable claim. They're going to argue that the lifestyle you both enjoyed, the social position, the network he built, that those things contributed indirectly to the appreciation of your assets. It's not a strong argument legally, but it's an argument. I know, Elena said. They may also get personal. They may argue that your management of assets during the marriage constituted a form of financial concealment, that you deliberately kept him uninformed. I kept my personal accounts private. I didn't hide them. I know, but there's a difference between what's true and what a story sounds like when it's told a certain way in a courtroom. Patricia looked at her steadily. I need you to be prepared for the version of you that Grant's attorneys are going to present. It won't be flattering. Elena nodded. She had known this was coming. She had known it the way you know a cold front is approaching before the temperature actually drops. A particular quality to the air, a pressure change you can feel in your joints before you can name it. Tell me what to do, she said, and I'll do it. Patricia picked up her pen again. First, she said, we're going to build a timeline. Every asset, every account, every transaction, dated and sourced and tied to documentation. Unassailable. Then we're going to let Grant's team make their argument, and we're going to let the records answer. It was a strategy Elena understood instinctively, because it was the same one she had used her entire professional life. Build carefully, document everything, and let the structure speak for itself. Don't argue with people who doubt you. Show them the load-bearing walls. She gathered her files, and Patricia walked her to the elevator, and they shook hands in the way of two people who understood each other without needing to say so. In the elevator going down, Elena thought about the first property she had ever purchased. Not the lake house, but a small studio apartment at 25 that she had bought and renovated herself over 6 months of weekends, learning as she went, making mistakes that cost her time and occasionally money, and then selling it at a profit 2 years later. Nobody had known about that apartment except her. Not her parents, not her friends at the time, not Grant, whom she had not yet met. It had been her private laboratory, her proof of concept, her evidence to herself that she could do it. She had never stopped doing it. She had simply done it quietly, in the particular way of women who have learned that announcing a thing before it is finished only gives people more time to tell you why it won't work. The elevator reached the lobby, and the doors opened, and Elena walked out into the gray afternoon light. Grant's legal team was a 3-person unit from a firm across town that he had assembled with the specific intention of intimidating, which said something about the degree to which he had allowed this situation to become personal rather than practical. The lead attorney was a man named Douglas Crane, 55 years old, with a reputation for discovery processes that were more excavation than inquiry. He dug wide and he dug deep, and he was not particularly careful about what he disturbed in the process. Grant had worked opposite Crane twice in his career and had found him effective and exhausting in equal measure, which was precisely why he hired him. Crane met with Grant on a Thursday afternoon in a corner office that smelled like leather and old coffee, and he listened to the full account of the marriage, the assets, the lake house, and the gate incident with the particular focused stillness of someone cataloging information rather than reacting to it. When Grant finished, Crane leaned back and steepled his fingers. "What do you actually want out of this?" Crane said. "I want what I'm owed," Grant said. "I contributed to that life for 20 years. The lifestyle, the social network, the property appreciation, none of that happened in a vacuum." "That's a philosophical position," Crane said. "I'm asking what you want specifically. The house? Cash settlement? Ongoing income from her portfolio?" Grant was quiet for a moment. "The house," he said finally. "Or its value. I want to be made whole for what I put into that marriage." Crane looked at him without expression. "I'm going to be direct with you, because that's what you're paying me for. If the property predates the marriage and was purchased entirely with her premarital assets, and if there's no co-ownership on the deed, we are starting from a difficult position. There are joint contributions, renovation work." "How much?" Grant gave him the rough figure he had estimated. Crane wrote it down, looked at it, and set his pen aside with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing not to say what he was thinking. "That's not nothing," Crane said. "But against a $3 million property, a judge is going to need something stronger than renovation contributions to grant a significant ownership interest. What else do we have?" "She managed investment during the marriage. Substantial ones. I believe I have an equitable claim. If those investments were managed using marital funds or income, I don't know exactly how they were structured." Crane looked at him. "You were married to this woman for 20 years, and you don't know how her finances were structured." It was not a question. It sat in the room between them with an uncomfortable weight that Grant didn't particularly want to examine. "We kept separate accounts," Grant said. "It was a mutual arrangement." "Who proposed that arrangement?" Another pause. "She did." Crane picked up his pen again, turned it between his fingers once, and set it back down. "Mr. Holloway, I want to help you, and I'm going to do everything the law allows to build the strongest case possible. But I need you to understand that the discovery process may surface things about your wife's financial history that are going to make this harder rather than easier. If she was careful and documented, and from what you're describing, she sounds like someone who was very careful and very documented, then we may be looking at a settlement negotiation rather than a trial." "I'm not interested in a minimal settlement," Grant said. "Then we pursue discovery and see what we find." Crane opened a folder. "Tell me everything you know about her income, her accounts, her business activities during the marriage. Everything, even if it seems small." Grant talked for the better part of an hour. And as he talked, laying out the details of a financial life that had existed alongside his own for 2 decades without his full comprehension, he began to hear something in his own account that bothered him in a way he couldn't immediately articulate. He was describing a woman he had lived with, eaten with, slept beside, argued with, and loved in the incomplete way that people love when they are too busy performing their own importance to be genuinely curious about another person. And the woman he was describing, in the context of this office and this conversation, sounded nothing like the version of Elena he had carried in his head for 20 years. The version in his head was supportive, quiet, present in the background of his life, in the way that good furniture is present, reliably, without demanding attention. The woman in the account he was giving Douglas Crane was someone else entirely. He drove home from that meeting with the particular heavy silence of a man who has started asking a question he is not sure he wants answered. Celeste Veron had not anticipated the degree to which sharing an apartment with Grant Holloway would illuminate aspects of his character that admiring him from a professional distance had conveniently obscured. She had known him as a force in a room, someone who arrived and shifted the atmosphere, who told stories that landed precisely right, who could read a crowd and adjust himself to it with a skill that was almost musical. She had found this compelling, and she had told herself that what she was feeling was something more substantial than the simple flattery of being chosen by someone with that kind of presence. 3 weeks into cohabitation, she was beginning to understand that presence and partnership were not the same thing. Grant came home from his meeting with Crane in a mood that he did not describe and did not invite discussion about. He ate the dinner she had made without commenting on it, which was not unusual, but there was an added distance to him that evening, a quality of someone moving through a space without registering it. Celeste watched him from across the table and thought, not for the first time, that she was not entirely sure who she had invited into her apartment. "How did the meeting go?" she asked. "Fine," he said. "Crane, was he useful?" "He's thorough." Grant pushed some food around his plate. "He asked good questions." "That's what you want in a divorce attorney." "Yes." He set his fork down. "He asked what I actually wanted, not strategically. What I wanted." Celeste waited. "I told him the house," Grant said, "or its value." He looked at the table rather than at her. "But I'm not sure that's true, actually. I'm not sure what I want." This was more honest than he had been with her in 3 weeks, and Celeste recognized it as such, which made it both welcome and slightly alarming. She had not signed up for his uncertainty. She had signed up for his certainty, which had been, in retrospect, a distinction worth examining. "Maybe you want things to be the way they were," she said. "Before." Grant looked at her then. "No," he said, and his voice was flat and definitive in the way it got when he was being completely truthful. "That's not it either." He went to bed early and lay in the dark of Celeste's bedroom for a long time not sleeping, and thought about a woman standing at a window overlooking a lake on the morning he had told her their marriage was over, and the particular quality of stillness she had had about her shot. Not shock, not grief, not the performance of either. Just stillness. Like someone who had been waiting, patiently and with full knowledge, for a train that was already visible down the track. He was beginning to understand what that stillness had meant. He was beginning to understand that Elena had known, and had prepared, and had stood in her kitchen that morning with 20 years of documentation organized in files he had never thought to ask about, and let him walk out believing he was the one making the move. He lay in Celeste's bedroom and stared at the ceiling and felt, beneath the irritation and the legal strategy and the careful management of his own narrative, something that sat lower and quieter than all of it. He felt foolish. The first document production from Elena's team arrived at Crane's office on a Tuesday, and Crane called Grant that same afternoon. "I've had a chance to go through the initial disclosure," Crane said. "I want to meet with you tomorrow morning." "What does it look like?" A brief pause that told Grant more than words would have. "It looks thorough," Crane said. "Come in at 9. Grant arrived at 9 exactly, and Crane had the documents spread across his conference table in the same organized way that Patricia had spread them across hers, except that the view from Crane's conference room faced a parking structure rather than a river, which somehow suited the mood. Crane walked him through it section by section. The lake house deed and its original purchase records. Elena's premarital financial history, each element dated and cross-referenced. The investment portfolio statements from 26 years back to the present, showing continuous growth and consistent management, with every transaction traceable to either premarital funds or Elena's personal postmarital income. The architectural consulting records, the tax filings, the family trust documents. Grant sat across from his attorney and read what was placed in front of him, and the reading took a long time because there was a great deal of it, and because he found himself repeatedly having to stop and reprocess what he was seeing. "This portfolio," he said at one point, indicating a summary sheet. "This is the current value?" "As of last quarter," Crane said. Grant looked at the number. Then he looked at it again. He had known Elena had investments. He had known she had done well. He had not known the scale of it because he had never asked, and she had never offered, and the comfortable assumption that they were roughly equivalent in their financial positions. That whatever she had was a supplement to the main structure, which was his career and his income, had sat undisturbed in the back of his mind like furniture he'd stopped seeing. The number on the sheet was not a supplement. "She built this during our marriage?" he said. "She built it before your marriage," Crane said carefully, "and continued to grow it during, using her own income and her own accounts. There's no marital money in this portfolio, Grant, not in any traceable way. She was earning that kind of income while we were married, and I didn't—" He stopped. "You didn't know," Crane said. "I knew she consulted. I knew she did projects." "Did you ever ask what she earned from them?" The honest answer was no. He had known she worked, and he had been glad she worked, because he was not a man who would have been comfortable with a wife who didn't, and he had told himself this said something positive about him. But the specifics, the contracts, the clients, the income, had existed in that same category as the portfolio and the property records. Things that were Elena's, and therefore not urgently his concern, because whatever was Elena's was adjacent to his life without being separate from it, except that it had been entirely separate from it. "What are we looking at?" Grant said. "Realistically," Crane folded his hands on the table, "realistically, we have a claim on the joint account contributions to property maintenance. We have an argument for lifestyle contribution, the social and professional network you provided, the income you contributed to household costs, which freed her capital for investment. These are not nothing, but they are unlikely to produce a result proportionate to what you're hoping for." What would a realistic settlement look like? Crane named a figure. It was not a small number in absolute terms. In relation to what Elena actually held, it was a rounding error. Grant sat with this for a while. Outside the window, a truck was maneuvering through the parking structure below with the slow, grinding difficulty of something too large for the space it was trying to occupy, and Grant watched it without really seeing it. "She knew," he said finally. "She knew exactly what she had and exactly how it was structured, and she has known for 20 years. "It appears so," Crane said. "And I never—" He stopped again. The sentence didn't have a good ending, and he knew it, so he let it hang unfinished in the air between them. Crane waited a professional moment before speaking. "Grant, I've been doing this work for a long time, and in my experience, the people who come into these proceedings most prepared are the people who had the most reason to prepare. That's not an accusation, it's an observation." Grant didn't respond to this. He picked up the summary sheet with the portfolio value on it and looked at it one more time, then set it back down. "What do you recommend?" he said. "I recommend we continue discovery, because there may be areas where we can strengthen our position. But I also recommend you start thinking seriously about settlement, because the longer this proceeds, the more it costs you in legal fees and the more it costs you in other ways." Crane looked at him levelly. "Your professional reputation is not irrelevant to this process. You're a public figure in this legal community. A contentious, high-profile divorce proceeding in which your financial claims are repeatedly undermined by documentation is not a neutral event for your career." This had not occurred to Grant, which was unusual, because he thought about his reputation constantly and automatically in almost every other context of his life. The fact that it had not surfaced here said something about the degree to which this situation had knocked him sideways in ways he hadn't fully registered. "Give me a few days," he said. "Take the week," Crane said, "but don't take longer than that. Discovery timelines don't pause for reflection." Elena was in the boathouse when Marcus called to tell her that a car matching Grant's had been seen on the county road near the property entrance, idling for several minutes before driving away. She was working on a set of preliminary sketches for a project, a renovation consultation she had taken on for a client in the Lake District 2 counties north, a converted farmhouse that needed structural work before it could be safely expanded. She had her drafting materials spread across the work table that occupied one corner of the boathouse, and the late afternoon light coming through the high windows fell across the paper at an angle that was almost too good to work in, too full and golden, the kind of light that made you want to stop and simply sit in it rather than draw through it. "Just idling?" she said. "About 4 minutes," Marcus said. Then he left, headed back toward the highway. "All right. Thank you, Marcus." She set the phone down and looked at her sketches. 4 minutes was a specific amount of time to sit outside a locked gate. It was long enough to have a conversation with yourself that you hadn't finished having when you arrived, and not long enough to have resolved it. She knew Grant well enough to read something in that. He was recalculating. He had gotten far enough into the discovery process to see the shape of what was coming at him, and he was sitting outside her gate in his car trying to figure out what it meant and what he did next. That was what 4 minutes of idling on a county road meant, if you knew the person doing it. She felt something about this that was not quite pity and not quite satisfaction, and was, if she was being honest with herself, closer to a tired kind of sorrow. Not for what she was losing, but for the waste of it. 20 years of a man who had never once been curious enough about her to ask the right questions, who had stood in the middle of everything she had built and looked at it as a reflection of himself, and who was now sitting outside a locked gate in the dark, trying to understand how it had happened. She picked up her pencil and went back to her sketches. The farmhouse renovation had a foundation problem on the north side that the current owners hadn't noticed because the damage was invisible from the surface. You had to know to look for it, to get below the finished floor and examine what was actually holding the structure up. She had seen it immediately on her first site visit, the way she always saw these things, and she had sat with it for a day before telling the clients, because she wanted to be certain she understood the full extent of it before she spoke. Some problems looked small from the outside, she had learned, and turned out to go all the way down. She worked until the light failed, and then she covered her drawings and walked back to the main house across the grass, the lake dark and quiet to her left, the birch trees at the gate standing pale and still at the far end of the drive. She could not see the county road from here. She did not need to. Whatever Grant was working through on the other side of that gate, he would work through it in his own time, in the way people work through things they should have examined years before they became urgent. She went inside, made tea, and called her daughter from her first drafting partner, a woman named Roz who had moved to the coast, and who called her every few weeks to check in and occasionally to argue about architectural theory, which was one of Elena's preferred forms of conversation. "How are you actually doing?" Rose asked. "Not legally, actually." Elena thought about it. "I'm sleeping well," she said, which was true. "The boathouse project is interesting, and I've been thinking about something new for the East Lawn." "What kind of something new?" "I'm not sure yet. I have an idea, but Claude's response was interrupted. Part 3. Louis, viết 5500, 6000, to liên kết liên với các phần trước trong câu chuyện và hội thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới, liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch, sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lan man, nhân vật không hoàn hảo, hồi thoại tự nhiên, tránh ngôn ngữ văn chương sáo rơi và cụm từ AI điển hình. Viết như nhà văn chuyên nghiệp, không như AI cố gắng nghe sàng. Có yếu tố con người, cấm miêu tả qua mượt mà và hoàn hảo. Kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau, câu chuyện không nhắc đến Chúa. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document. Đăng bắt buộc, không được xuất hiện trong nội dung truyện. Đây là một câu chuyện điện ảnh hoàn toàn hư cấu được tạo ra chỉ nhằm mục đích giải trí. Không đề cập hay ngụ ý rằng nó dựa trên sự kiện có thật, người thật hoặc câu chuyện có thật. Khi không sử dụng các cụm từ như dựa trên một câu chuyện có thật, theo ghi chép hoặc bất cứ điều gì tương tự. Tất cả các nhân vật, địa điểm, tổ chức và sự kiện phải hoàn toàn hư cấu, lưu ý đặc biệt quan trọng. Nếu đạt đến giới hạn trả lời, không được dùng giữa câu hay viết nốt câu đó hoàn chỉnh không mở rộng nội dung. Show more needs more time before it becomes a real plan. I want to do something with the East Lawn that actually means something, not just landscaping. You're already designing your next chapter, Rouse said. You know that, right? Most people fall apart during a divorce. You're out there sketching. Falling apart doesn't fix the foundation, Elena said. Rouse laughed. The specific laugh of someone who has known you long enough to recognize when you are being funny and when you are being completely literal and has accepted that with you it is often both simultaneously. They talked for another 40 minutes about the farmhouse project and about Roz's recent work and about a book they had both been reading and arguing about in fragments across 3 separate phone calls. When they hung up, Elena sat in the kitchen for a while in the particular quiet of a house that has been yours alone long enough to start feeling like itself again, and she finished her tea and she went to bed. Outside, the lake was dark and the gate was locked and the birch trees stood exactly where they had always stood, indifferent and patient and entirely unconcerned with what happened on either side of them. The deposition was scheduled for a Wednesday, and Grant arrived 12 minutes early, which was unlike him. He was usually precisely on time, not early, not late, exactly on time, because he had spent enough years in courtrooms to understand that arriving early communicated something, and arriving late communicated something, and arriving exactly on time communicated that you had decided what you wanted to communicate. 12 minutes early meant his internal calibration was off, and he knew it, and knowing it did not fix it. Patricia Sue's conference room was smaller than Crane's. The chairs were the same basic variety, padded, businesslike, designed to be sat in for long periods without becoming comfortable enough to encourage relaxation. Elena was already seated when Grant came in, which he had not expected. He had expected to arrive before her and have the territorial advantage of being settled when she entered. Instead, she was there, in a dark blue jacket, her reading glasses on the table beside a neat stack of documents, speaking quietly with Patricia about something that stopped when the room filled with other people. Elena looked up when Grant entered. She nodded at him, briefly and without warmth, but also without hostility, the way you might acknowledge a contractor who had come to discuss a disputed invoice. Grant nodded back. He took a seat across the table and arranged his notes and did not look at her again for several minutes, because he needed a moment to reorganize something in himself that her simple presence in the room had managed to disturb. Douglas Crane sat beside him, solid and unhurried, and the court reporter set up her equipment at the end of the table, and the proceeding began with the flat declarative language of legal process. Names, dates, the case number, the nature of the proceeding, the oath. The questions started with the easy things: duration of marriage, shared residence, joint accounts. Grant answered cleanly, because these were facts and facts were his most comfortable territory. But then Crane had warned him about the territory shift that would come, and it came approximately 40 minutes in, when Patricia set a document on the table and slid it across to the court reporter, and then looked at Grant and said, in the pleasant, careful voice she used for questions that were not pleasant at all, "Mr. Holloway, I'd like to ask you about your understanding of your wife's professional activities during the marriage." Grant said he understood she had done architectural consulting. Patricia asked if he knew the names of any clients she had worked with during the marriage. He named 2. There had been at least 11. Patricia asked if he knew the approximate annual income she had generated from this consulting work. He gave a figure that was less than a third of the actual number. Patricia did not react to this. She simply made a note and moved to the next question, which was about the investment portfolio, and Grant's answers there were also incomplete in ways that would have been invisible to anyone who didn't already have the correct numbers in front of them. Patricia had the correct numbers in front of her. She had had them for weeks. The deposition was 3 hours long. By the end of it, Grant had a very precise understanding of what the record now showed. A man who had lived alongside a substantial financial enterprise for 20 years and had, through a combination of incuriosity and assumption, understood almost none of it. This was not the portrait of a man who had been deceived. It was the portrait of a man who had not looked. Crane knew it. Grant knew it. And Elena, who sat quietly through the portions of the proceeding that concerned her, and answered her own questions with the steady, documented specificity of someone who had been waiting for exactly this conversation, knew it most of all. When they broke for a recess, Grant went to the men's room and stood at the sink running cold water over his wrists, an old habit from high-pressure trial days, something that helped him reset, and looked at himself in the mirror for a moment with an expression that he couldn't entirely categorize. It was not defeat, quite. It was something adjacent to the feeling you get when you have been arguing a position for a long time, and the evidence finally accumulates past the point where arguing is worth the energy. He went back into the conference room and finished the deposition, and when it was over, he shook hands with the appropriate people with the appropriate professionalism and walked to the elevator with Crane without speaking. In the elevator, Crane said, "We should talk." "I know," Grant said. They found a coffee place 2 blocks from the building, a narrow spot with small tables and bad lighting that suited the conversation they needed to have. Crane ordered black coffee. Grant ordered the same thing and didn't touch it. "I want to give you my honest assessment," Crane said. "Go ahead." "The deposition went as I expected, which is to say, it went in her direction." Crane wrapped both hands around his cup. "Your lack of knowledge about her financial activities is now on the record. That cuts both ways. It undermines the concealment argument, Because concealment requires active deception, and what the record shows is passive non-disclosure on her part and active non-inquiry on yours. A judge is going to look at that and see a man who chose not to ask, not a woman who chose to hide. Grant said nothing. The equitable contribution argument is still viable, Crane continued. Your income to the joint household, your professional network, the social position that may have benefited her consulting work. We can still build something there. But I want you to hear me when I tell you that building that argument is going to take time and money, and it is going to require us to get into very personal territory about your marriage, about your respective contributions, about how you spent your time and her time, and what each of you gave to the arrangement. It's going to be unpleasant. And at the end of it, Crane picked up his coffee, thought about it, set it back down. At the end of it, we're likely looking at a settlement in the range I mentioned, give or take. The range doesn't change substantially even if we go all the way to trial. What changes is the cost of getting there and what the process does to your reputation in this community. Grant looked at the table. There's something else, Crane said. What? I had a conversation with Patricia Sue this morning before the deposition. Off the record, just between counsel. She told me Elena is not interested in punishing you. She's not looking to take your firm's income. She's not trying to damage your career. She's not going to go to the press. What she wants is for this to be over cleanly and for each party to leave with what they actually own. Which, in my case, is your personal savings, which are not insubstantial, your retirement accounts, your car, your professional assets, everything that is genuinely yours. Crane looked at him steadily. She's not trying to take anything from you, Grant. She's trying to keep what's hers. Grant sat with this. The coffee shop noise moved around him. Someone at the counter ordering, the hiss of a machine, two women at the table beside them having a conversation about something completely ordinary, laughing about it, easy and uncomplicated. If I accept the settlement, Grant said, it resolves quickly. You both move forward. And the house stays with her, yes. Grant nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are not agreeing so much as accepting the shape of something they cannot change. He picked up his coffee and finally drank some of it, and it was bad coffee. The kind that's been sitting too long, slightly bitter, in a way that no amount of concentration could make acceptable. I need a few more days, he said. I understand, Crane said, but I'd encourage you not to wait too long. The cleaner this ends, the better it is for both of you. And I think, on some level, you know that. Grant drove back to Celeste's apartment in the kind of silence that has nothing to do with quiet. Oh? The news that the deposition had gone well reached Elena through Patricia later that same afternoon, delivered in the measured, informational tone that Patricia used for things she had expected. Elena was at the farmhouse site 2 counties north, walking the North Foundation with the structural engineer she had brought in to confirm her initial assessment. The engineer's name was Howard Park, a compact and meticulous man in his 60s who communicated entirely in precise measurements and who had the specific quality Elena valued most in the people she worked with. He told her what was true rather than what she wanted to hear. The settlement point on the northeast corner is about a 1/4 inch worse than your initial read, Howard said, crouching with his level. Still within manageable range, but you want to address it before winter. Another season of freeze-thaw and it accelerates. What's the remediation? Elena said. Helical piers, minimum 6, probably 8 to be safe on this soil type. Exterior access, so you're not tearing up the interior floors. 8 to 10 weeks of work. Cost range? Howard gave her a number. She noted it, asked 2 follow-up questions, and then her phone buzzed with Patricia's call, and she excused herself and walked to the edge of the property where the land dropped away toward a field of cut hay. Patricia gave her the summary in 4 sentences. The deposition had established the record they needed. Grant's lack of knowledge about her finances was now documented. Crane had spoken to her before the proceeding. She expected a settlement approach within the week. How do you want to handle it when it comes? Patricia asked. Straightforwardly, Elena said. No games, no delays. If the number is fair, we close it. Defined as fair. Defined as what I'm actually obligated to contribute based on what we genuinely shared, not what he assumed was his. She paused. I'm not going to be punitive about this, Patricia. I've never wanted to be punitive. I just want it to be accurate. That's a sensible position, Patricia said, and frankly, it's a more generous position than most people in your situation would take. I'm not interested in most people's situations, Elena said. I'm interested in mine. She ended the call and stood at the edge of the field for a moment, looking at the cut hay lying in long, pale rows across the ground, the smell of it dry and clean in the late afternoon air. There was something satisfying about a cut field, all that growth reduced to something ordered and horizontal, ready for the next season. She had always found farming landscapes clarifying in a way that was hard to articulate, something about the visibility of labor and time in the patterns on the ground. She went back to Howard, and they finished the site walk, and she drove home in the early evening with the windows down and the radio on a station she didn't particularly care about, letting the noise fill the car because sometimes what you need is not silence, but something to put between yourself and your own thoughts. Grant came back to the lake house on a Saturday. Not to the gate. He didn't approach the gate. He drove along the county road that ran behind the northern edge of the property, where the land was lower and the fence line was visible through the trees. And he parked on the shoulder and got out and stood in the thin shade of the tree line, looking at what he could see of the property through the fence. He could see the boathouse from here, and a portion of the dock, and the eastern face of the main house, the addition he had always thought of as something they had built together, the expanded guest wing with its tall windows and the stone detail along the waterline. Standing here looking at it through a fence from the outside, it looked different than he expected. Not smaller exactly, just more itself, less related to him than it had always seemed when he was inside it. He stood there for a while in the August heat, not accomplishing anything in particular, which was an unusual experience for a man who organized his time with professional precision. A figure appeared on the dock, Elena, in a hat and a light shirt, carrying something toward the boathouse. She moved without hurry, the way she always moved at the property, with the easy purposefulness of someone who belonged completely to a place and knew it. She didn't look toward the road. She went into the boathouse and the dock was empty again. Grant got back in his car. He sat with the engine off for another few minutes, which brought his total time on that stretch of county road to somewhere close to 20 minutes, which was longer than he'd intended to stay, and which told him something about what he had come there looking for, even if he couldn't name it precisely. He had come, he understood slowly, to see if it looked like what he had lost. And it did. But not in the way he had expected. It did not look like his house, viewed from the outside. It looked like her house, unambiguously, completely, in its bones and its atmosphere and the way she moved through it. It had always been hers. He had spent 20 years living in it and contributing to it and accepting its comforts and calling it home, and it had always, despite all of that, been hers. He drove back to the city with this understanding sitting in the passenger seat beside him, heavy and specific, the way understanding tends to be when it arrives 20 years late. Crane called on Monday with the settlement framework. Grant listened to the terms, asked 3 clarifying questions, and then said he needed to think until Wednesday. Wednesday he called back and said he had 1 counteroffer on a single component, which was a slightly different structure for the timeline of payment. Patricia reviewed it, spoke with Elena, and called back within the hour with acceptance. The legal formalities took another 6 weeks. Documents prepared and reviewed and signed. Accounts evaluated and inventored. The joint household account divided cleanly, because it had always been kept lean by mutual habit. Most of what either of them had was separately theirs, and the joint account had served its household purpose and nothing more. Grant signed his portion of the settlement documents on a Thursday morning in Crane's office, using the same pen he used for every document he signed, a habit he'd had since law school, a dark blue roller with his initials on the clip, the kind of consistency that had once felt like identity and now felt like what it was, which was just a preference. When it was done, Crane shook his hand. "You handled this with more clarity than most people manage," Crane said. "That counts for something." Grant wasn't sure what it counted for. He pocketed his pen and thanked Crane for his work, and walked out into a Thursday that was unremarkably sunny, and he drove to the office because there was a brief he needed to finish, and work, at least, was something he understood completely, and that understood him back. Elena signed her documents on the same Thursday in Patricia's office with the river view. Patricia poured 2 small glasses of wine from a bottle she kept in her credenza for these occasions, not champagne, just a quiet red, and handed one to Elena. "To accuracy," Elena said. Patricia looked at her over the rim of her glass. "To accuracy," she agreed. They didn't linger on it. Elena had a site meeting in the afternoon, and Patricia had another client at 2, and they shook hands in the elevator hallway with the warmth of people who had worked well together and knew they would likely not see each other again, which was the best possible outcome of the kind of work Patricia did. The drive back to the lake house took 40 minutes on a Thursday afternoon with light traffic, and Elena made it in 38. She turned off the county road onto the gravel drive, and the gate swung open at the signal from her remote, on her gate at the entrance to her property. And the birch trees lined the drive on both sides, white-trunked and quiet, exactly as they had been when she planted them 25 years ago, and exactly as they would be, she expected, long after any of this had ceased to matter. She parked in front of the house and sat in the car for a moment with the engine off. The lake was visible from here, a band of blue-gray between the house and the tree line to the east. A heron was standing on the dock in the particular motionless way herons have, fully present and utterly still, paying no attention to anything except whatever it was paying attention to, which was its own business. She got out of the car. She walked to the front door, which she unlocked with her key, which had never been anyone else's key, and she stepped inside, and the house was cool and quiet and arranged exactly as she had arranged it, and nothing in it required her explanation or her defense or her apology. She went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. While the water heated, she stood at the window and thought about the idea she had been developing for the east lawn, the one she had mentioned to Ross and let sit for weeks while the legal proceedings consumed her attention. It had clarified while she wasn't looking directly at it, the way ideas sometimes do. Not landscaping, she had known from the beginning. Something with structure and purpose. Something that would make the east lawn into a place where things actually happened rather than simply a view. A space for work, for gathering, for the kind of conversation she had always valued most, the ones that started with a problem and moved, through patience and precision and the willingness to examine what was actually load-bearing, towards something that might hold. The kettle came to a boil, and she poured her tea, and she stood at the window in the house that was hers, looking at the lawn that was hers, thinking about what she was going to build next. The news about the settlement reached the legal community in the way that news always reaches small professional worlds, indirectly, incompletely, and faster than anyone intends. By the following week, 3 different people in Grant's professional circle had found occasion to mention, in varying degrees of indirection, that they had heard things had resolved, and the versions they had heard were already beginning to differ from each other in the particular way that stories drift when they pass through enough people who each add a small interpretation of their own. What the stories had in common was this. Grant had pursued a legal challenge to assets that turned out to be entirely and documentably his wife's. And the challenge had not succeeded. And the reason it had not succeeded was that Elena Brooks had spent 20 years building something that she had never once allowed him to mistake for a joint venture, even when he had assumed it was. Margaret Fitch heard the most accurate version because she had access to people who knew the details, and she did not discuss it with anyone, because she was not that kind of person. What she did was send Grant a brief email, 3 lines, which said only, "I'm glad it resolved. Take care of yourself." The Delacroix brief has a gap in section 4 that we should discuss when you're ready. Grant read the email on Friday morning and felt something in it that was closer to kindness than he deserved, and he replied with 2 lines thanking her and saying he would come by on Monday about Delacroix, and he meant both things. Found an apartment. She had started looking, she told him, about 2 weeks after he moved in, which was a piece of information that Grant received without surprise and with a kind of grim appreciation for her self-awareness. They had the conversation over takeout containers at her kitchen table on a Wednesday evening, and it was not a pleasant conversation, but it was an honest one, which was more than either of them had managed for several weeks. "I think I knew pretty early that this wasn't what either of us actually needed," Celeste said. She was not cruel about it. She was matter-of-fact, which was somehow more difficult. "You're not wrong," Grant said. "I didn't want to be the person who broke up a marriage," she said. "I told myself I wasn't, that the marriage was already broken, but it wasn't fully broken until I decided it was," Grant said. "That's on me, not you." Celeste looked at him. "Are you okay?" He thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet," he said. "I think I'm going to be, but I don't know yet." She moved out 2 weeks later, and Grant stayed in the apartment for another month while he arranged something more permanent, and he found the solitude during that month clarifying in the specific way that solitude is clarifying when you stop resisting it and allow it to do its work. He ran in the mornings. He read things he had been meaning to read for years. He went to the office earlier than anyone else and stayed later and found, in the disciplined narrowness of work, something that felt like solid ground. He did not drive past the lake house again. He told himself this was a decision he had made, and for the most part he believed it. What Elena had not told anyone, not Patricia, not Roz, not Marcus, was that she had started working on the East Lawn project the day after she signed the settlement documents. She had been out there at 7 in the morning with a set of preliminary sketches on a clipboard and a measuring tape, walking the dimensions of the space with the focused attention she gave to any site before she committed to a design. The East Lawn was larger than it appeared from the house, nearly 3/4 of an acre when you measured it properly, with a natural grade that dropped gently toward the lake and a cluster of mature oak trees along the southern edge that had been there longer than the house itself. She had spent an hour walking and measuring and making notes, and then she had gone inside and made breakfast and sat at the kitchen table and worked on the sketches for the rest of the morning, and she had felt, during those hours, something she could only identify as forward motion. Not the relieved forward motion of an ending, but the particular momentum of something beginning. She was not entirely sure yet what she was building. She knew it involved the oaks and the grade and the way the morning light moved across the space from east to west, and she knew it involved other people, that the space she was designing was not for solitude but for gathering. She had an idea about the function that was still loose and provisional, an instinct more than a plan. But she had learned long ago to trust her instincts when they were specific enough to act on, and this one was specific enough. She made a call that afternoon to a woman she had worked with years ago, before the marriage, before Europe, a woman named Diane Sutherland who had built and run a business mentorship program for women in the city for 15 years and who had mentioned at a lunch they'd had 8 months ago that she was looking for a physical space for an expanded program, something outside the city, somewhere that felt removed from the ordinary pressures of professional life. Elena had filed this away at the time, without knowing exactly why. She called Diane and told her she had a property she wanted to talk about. Diane said, "I've been hoping you'd call," which was not a thing Elena had expected, and she asked what Diane meant. "I heard about the divorce," Diane said. "Not the details, just that it happened. And I thought, Elena Brooks with that property, and no reason to keep it quiet anymore. That sounds like something could be possible." Elena looked out her window at the east lawn and the oak trees and the morning light still lying long across the grass, and she thought about load-bearing walls and foundations and the difference between a structure that is built to impress and one that is built to last. "Come on Saturday," she said. "I'll show you what I'm thinking." Diane Sutherland arrived on Saturday at 10 in the morning, driving a dark green sedan that had seen better decades and that she parked slightly crooked on the gravel in front of the house, in the way of someone who had never been particularly concerned with the cosmetic details of arrival. She was 63, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of direct eye contact that made some people uncomfortable and that Elena had always found refreshing. She had spent 15 years building a mentorship program that had placed over 400 women into funded business ventures, and she wore the work the way you wear something that fits, naturally, without announcement. Elena met her at the gate with coffee, and they walked the east lawn before they sat down, because Elena had learned that the best way to talk about a space was to be inside it while you talked. The morning was clear, and the light across the lawn was still low enough to be useful, cutting through the oak trees at an angle that showed the natural contour of the land in a way that midday light would flatten. Elena walked Diane through the dimensions she had measured, pointed out the grade change and where it leveled near the lake edge, showed her the cluster of oaks and the way the southern boundary opened toward a natural clearing that had no particular use at the moment beyond looking pleasant. Diane walked with her hands in her jacket pockets and said very little, which was one of the things Elena appreciated about her. She looked carefully, and she didn't fill silence with noise. "How much of this could be developed?" Diane asked finally, standing at the edge of the clearing. "All of it structurally," Elena said. "The soil is solid. The grade is manageable. I'd want to preserve the oaks. They're the best thing on this side of the property, but you work around them, not through them." "What are you thinking in terms of structures?" "One main gathering building. Open plan, good acoustics, natural light from the east and north. Flexible enough to work as a workshop space, a presentation space, a working studio. Attached or adjacent, I haven't decided. A smaller residential wing, 6 to 8 rooms. Not a hotel, more like a working residence, somewhere people can stay for a week or two while they're in a program. Diane turned to look at her. You've been thinking about this for a while. I've been thinking about it the way you think about things when you're not quite ready to do them yet, Elena said. The shape has been clear for a while. The timing wasn't. They walked back to the house and Elena poured more coffee and they sat at the kitchen table with Elena's sketches between them. Rough working drawings, not presentations, the kind you make for yourself when you're working something out, rather than showing it to someone. Diane looked at them for several minutes without speaking. Tell me what you see this being, Diane said. Not architecturally, what you see it being for. Elena thought about how to say it accurately. I've watched a specific kind of woman come through my professional life for 30 years, she said. Women who are doing serious work, building something real, with real competence and real capital, and who are doing it without a structure around them that reflects what they're actually doing. They're working in corners. They're serious people without serious space. She set down her cup. I want to build them the serious space. Diane looked at the sketches for another moment. My program has 42 active participants right now. I have a wait list of 60. I've been trying to find a residential component for 3 years because the research is consistent. Immersive, place-based programming produces substantially better outcomes than the weekly session model. But space in the city is impossible, and space outside the city that isn't either a corporate conference center or someone's repurposed barn is hard to find, Elena said, is essentially non-existent. Diane looked up. What are you proposing exactly? Partnership? Lease? You build, I operate? I want to build it right, Elena said, which means I want to be involved in how it functions, not just the structure. I'm not interested in building a shell and handing you the keys. But I'm also not trying to run your program. You know that work better than I do. She paused. I'm thinking something like a joint operating structure. The property stays mine, the program stays yours. We build a governance model that lets both of those things be true without either of us having to pretend we're not what we are. Diane was quiet for a moment. Outside, the lake was visible through the kitchen window, moving slightly in a morning breeze, small gray ripples crossing the surface from east to west. You know what's interesting about this conversation, Diane said, is that you've just described the governance structure that every woman in my program spends the first 3 months trying to figure out how to build for her own business. Separate ownership, shared operation, clear lines of authority, no pretending. It's not complicated in principle, Elena said. It's just uncomfortable to insist on, which is why most people don't. Diane smiled. It was not a soft smile. It was the smile of someone who recognized something. When could you break ground? Assuming permits move at a normal pace, which they rarely do, spring. I'd want to spend the fall finalizing the design and getting the engineering right. I don't build fast and I don't build cheap. I don't need fast, Diane said. I need right. She picked up one of the sketches, the one that showed the oak clearing with rough building outlines. Can I take this one to show my board? That one's a working sketch, Elena said. It's not a presentation drawing. I know. Diane held it up. That's why I want it. A working sketch tells them what you're actually thinking. Presentation drawings tell them what you want them to think you're thinking. Elena let her take it. After Diane left, Elena walked the east lawn again alone, this time without the clipboard and the measuring tape. The morning had warmed and the light had shifted to the flat, even quality of midday, and the oaks cast their shade in soft-edged pools across the grass. She walked through one of those pools and felt the temperature difference, several degrees cooler under the canopy, the way it always was under mature trees. And she stood there for a moment, just inhabiting the temperature change, feeling the boundary between sun and shade as a physical thing. This was what she had been waiting to do with the property. Not waiting as in delayed, waiting as in saving something for the right moment, the way you save a particular resource for the work that actually warrants it. The lake house had been her private world for 26 years, and it had served that purpose faithfully. But private worlds had a way of becoming insufficient over time, and she had been feeling that insufficiency for several years in a quiet background way that had been easy to mistake for ordinary restlessness. It was not restlessness, it was readiness. She went inside and called Roz. I'm doing it, she said when Roz picked up. The East Lawn thing. Yes. I knew you were going to do it, Roz said. You've been circling it for 2 years. What made it land? The conversation with Diane, Elena said. And everything else. The divorce, the legal process, all of it. When you spend 6 months fighting to keep what's yours, you start thinking very clearly about what you want to do with it. What does the timeline look like? Fall for design finalization, spring for groundbreaking, 12 to 14 months of construction if everything goes reasonably, which it won't. Nothing ever goes reasonably on a 14-month construction timeline, Rose said. No, Elena agreed, but the end result is usually worth the unreasonable middle. Grant Holloway moved into a rented house on the west side of the city in October, 3 months after the divorce was finalized. It was a decent house, 2 stories, brick exterior, a small yard with a tree he didn't know the name of, and it was entirely temporary in a way he found, unexpectedly, a relief. He had lived in the lake house for 20 years and had thought of it as permanent in the way you think of things that have been true for a long time, conflating duration with permanence, and the removal of that permanence, which had felt like loss when it first happened, had become over time something more interesting. He was, for the first time in 2 decades, choosing what to do with a space rather than inheriting the choices already made by it. He painted the front room himself on a Saturday in October, which he had not done since he was 29. He was bad at it. The edges were uneven in several places, and he used too much paint on the roller and had to go back and correct streaks. But there was something in the physical labor of it, the smell of the paint and the specific tiredness in his arms at the end of the day, that he found useful in a way he couldn't entirely articulate. Margaret came by the following week to look at it, not because she had been invited, but because she had taken it upon herself to check in on him in the way she occasionally did, appearing with a bottle of wine and a folder of work materials as though the social call needed camouflage. The edges are bad, she said, looking at the front room. I know. You should have used painter's tape. I know that now, he said. She handed him the wine and looked around the room. It's a good color, though, better than whatever that beige was before. The beige was already here. Still, this is better. She settled into the one chair he owned in that room and opened the folder. Delacroix settled last week. I wanted to tell you in person. Good settlement? Better than expected. The clause we restructured in Section 4 was the key. She handed him the summary document. You were right about that, by the way. The gap was smaller than it looked from the outside. Grant read through the summary. This was the comfortable territory. Work, language, argument, the architecture of a well-constructed legal position. He had been back in it fully for 2 months, and it had taken him the first month to stop feeling like a man performing competence and start feeling like a man who actually had it, which was a distinction that mattered and that nobody outside of his own head would have noticed. How are you? Margaret asked, in the way she asked it. Direct, no softening, the way she asked everything. Better, he said. Honestly better. Not back to what I was, but I'm not sure back to what I was is actually the goal. Margaret looked at him for a moment. No, she said. Probably not. She stayed for an hour. They talked about Delacroix, and about a new case that had come in, and about a young associate at the firm who had been showing work that was significantly above his level and who needed to be given more responsibility before he got bored and went somewhere else. These were comfortable, specific, known-world conversations, and Grant was grateful for them in a way that he probably didn't express adequately. After she left, he sat in the front room in the only chair and looked at the wall he had painted badly and thought about the fact that 6 months ago he had been standing at a locked gate in the cold, convinced that the life being held behind it was partly his, and the primary feeling he had now, sitting in this rented house in front of this badly painted wall, was not loss. It was something more like clarity, uncomfortable clarity, the kind that arrives after you've stopped arguing with something and simply looked at it, but clarity nonetheless. He had spent 20 years living inside Elena's life and calling it their life, and the distinction had mattered even when he hadn't seen it, and the not seeing had cost both of them something that neither the settlement nor the deposition nor the 4 minutes idling on a county road had ever fully addressed. He could not fix this. The time for fixing it had passed in gradual increments across 20 years of incuriosity. What he could do, what he was doing, he thought, imperfectly and without the performance of having figured it out, was look at it honestly. He went to bed in his rented house and slept reasonably well, which was more than he could have claimed 4 months ago. And in the morning he got up and ran and then went to the office and did his work, and the badly painted wall in the front room waited for him when he got home, patient and imperfect and entirely his own. Check. The permit process began in November and moved with the specific bureaucratic rhythm of permit processes, which is to say, it moved unevenly and occasionally backward and required Elena to appear in person at a county office on 3 separate occasions to answer questions that could have been resolved by reading the documents she had already submitted. She did this without losing her temper, which required more discipline than any of the architectural work, and she emerged from each visit with the permit process slightly further advanced and her faith in procedural efficiency slightly further diminished. Howard Park came back in December to finalize the structural engineering for the gathering building, and they spent 2 days on the site in weather that had turned cold and wet, Howard with his instruments and Elena with her drawings, working through the foundation plan for a structure that needed to sit well on the sloping grade while also relating visually to the oaks and not blocking the lake view from the main house. It was the kind of problem Elena had always found genuinely interesting. The intersection of structural necessity and visual intention, the place where engineering and design had to negotiate with each other rather than one simply overriding the other. She had been working on problems like this for 30 years, and she still found them absorbing in a way that had nothing to do with professional obligation. It was the thing itself that was interesting, the problem itself, the specific shape of this particular set of constraints on this particular piece of ground. "You're happy," Howard said on the second day, watching her work through a detail on the foundation drawing. She looked up. "Is that a professional observation?" "It's a human observation," he said. "I've worked with you on 4 projects. 3 of them you were going through something. I could tell you were slightly off your natural pace. This one, you're not." Elena considered this. It was a peculiar and oddly accurate thing for Howard Park, who communicated almost exclusively in measurements and load calculations, to say. "I'm working on something that belongs entirely to me," she said. "That probably makes a difference." Howard nodded as if this made complete engineering sense, and went back to his calculations. The foundation plan was finalized before Christmas. Diane's board had approved the partnership structure in November, after a meeting that Elena had been told went longer than expected but ended clearly. 3 of the board members had wanted to understand the governance model in detail, the separation of property ownership from program operation, the decision-making structure, the exit provisions. And Elena had answered their questions in the same way she answered all questions she was well prepared for, directly, completely, and without the defensive elaboration that signals uncertainty. The project had a name by December, agreed on in a 40-minute phone call between Elena and Diane that covered 3 other proposals before landing on the one that was simply accurate: groundwork. Not the Groundwork Center or the Groundwork Institute or any other appended formality. Just groundwork. Diane had suggested it, and Elena had said yes before she finished the sentence, because it was right in the way that the right name for a thing is immediately apparent once you hear it. You don't deliberate about it. You just recognize it. She told Roz over the phone, and Roz said, "That's it. That's completely it." And there was nothing else that needed to be said about it. Grant heard about the project in January, 8 months after he had left the lake house, from a woman named Sandra Cho, who sat on the County Arts Council and who had worked with Diane Sutherland's program for several years. Sandra mentioned it at a Bar Association event, not as information intended for Grant specifically, but as general community news, the kind of thing people discuss at Bar Association events when they've run out of professional topics. "Elena Brooks is building some kind of women's entrepreneurship center at the lake property," Sandra said to the group of 4 people she was talking to, of which Grant was one. "Breaking ground in the spring. Diane Sutherland's program is going to operate out of it. It's quite a big undertaking from what I understand." Grant said nothing. He took a small drink of his water and let the conversation move on to the next thing, because there were other people at that event who knew both him and Elena, and he was not going to give anyone a scene or a reaction to interpret. But he carried the information home with him, and he sat with it in the front room of his rented house for a while that evening. She was building something. Of course she was. That was what Elena did. She assessed a site, understood its structure, worked through the engineering problem, and built something that was meant to last. She had been doing this her entire adult life, through a marriage that had not seen it, and a divorce that had tried to challenge it, and a legal process that had, in the end, only confirmed what was already documented. He felt something about this that was not easy to categorize. It was not jealousy, exactly. It was not bitterness, though he had felt both of those things at various points and recognized them well enough to know they were absent now. It was closer to a kind of belated recognition, the feeling of understanding something about a person that you should have understood 20 years earlier and recognizing very clearly that the delay was yours. He had lived beside a woman who built things, and he had never once been curious enough to ask her how she did it. He turned off the light in the front room and went to bed, and in the morning he got up and ran and went to the office, and the badly painted wall was still there when he came home, and the tree in the yard he still didn't know the name of had lost all its leaves in the January cold and stood against the gray sky, looking entirely unperturbed by this condition, which he found, in a minor way, instructive. The groundbreaking happened on a Thursday in late March, which was not an auspicious day by any conventional measure, but was the day the weather cooperated and the permit was finally in hand and Howard's crew was available, and Elena had long since stopped organizing her life around conventional measures of auspiciousness. Diane brought 6 women from the current cohort of her program, and Marcus was there, and Howard, and the structural engineer's assistant, who was 24 and had never been to a groundbreaking and looked slightly unsure of the protocol, which Elena reassured her was minimal. There was no ceremony beyond standing on the east lawn in the pale March sunlight while Howard marked the foundation lines with spray paint on the dead winter grass, the orange lines cutting clean geometric shapes across the ground between the oaks. Elena stood at the edge of the marked area and looked at the shape of what was going to be built there, and felt the specific satisfaction of a plan moving from the inside of your head to the surface of the earth. The moment when a drawing becomes a place. One of the women from Diane's cohort, a young woman named Priya, who was building a materials sourcing company and who had barely said a word all morning, came to stand beside her. "Is it strange?" Priya asked, "seeing it start?" Elena looked at the orange lines on the grass, the geometry of the foundation described in spray paint against the brown of winter lawn, the oaks standing around it on 3 sides. "No," she said. "Starting is the part I understand best." Priya nodded, looking at the lines. "My company has been at the planning stage for 18 months, she said. "I keep revising the model. I keep thinking I need more information before I can move." Elena looked at her. She was 29, maybe 30, with the particular quality of someone who was genuinely intelligent and who was using that intelligence, at the moment, primarily to generate reasons for caution. "At some point," Elena said, "you have enough information. You just don't feel like you do." She looked back at the orange lines. "The feeling doesn't go away when you start, but once you're started, it becomes less important." Priya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did you know you were going to build this, back when you bought the property?" Elena thought about it honestly. "I knew I was building toward something," she said. "I didn't know what it was going to be." She paused. "I'm not sure it matters. The building is what prepares you for the thing you're building toward." The crew had started working at the northeast corner, the problem corner Howard had identified in December, and the sound of the equipment broke the morning quiet in a satisfying way. Not noise exactly, but evidence. Something was happening on this lawn, something that had been planned carefully and long, and that was now, finally, becoming physical. Elena watched for a while longer, and then she went inside to make coffee for everyone because it was cold, and the work was going to be long, and the least she could do was make sure the people doing it were warm. She stood at the kitchen window while the kettle heated and looked out at the east lawn, at the orange lines, and the crew and the equipment, and Diane talking with 2 of the women from her cohort near the oak trees, and the lake beyond all of it, gray-blue and entirely unimpressed with what was happening on its shore, which was the appropriate response of something that had been there for 10,000 years to the particular drama of human construction. The kettle came to a boil. Elena made the coffee and carried it outside, and the morning continued. Construction on the groundwork building took 14 months, which was 2 months longer than Howard's original estimate and 3 months shorter than Elena had privately expected, which meant it finished approximately where reality usually lands when you have been doing this kind of work long enough to know the difference between a schedule and a prediction. The delays were ordinary construction delays, a supplier issue with the window systems in June, 2 weeks of rain in August that pushed the exterior work back, a subcontractor on the electrical who turned out to be less organized than his bid had suggested, and whom Howard replaced in September with a woman named Carla, who was more expensive and considerably better. Elena had managed these problems the way she managed all problems on a build, directly, without drama, with the understanding that a problem you address immediately costs you a week, and a problem you defer costs you a month. She was on site twice a week through the summer and fall, sometimes more. She had her drafting materials set up in the boathouse, which had become her working studio in a way it hadn't been before. The work table cleared of everything except the current project, the high windows letting in the north light that was best for drawing. She worked mornings on the farmhouse renovation, which was finishing up its structural phase and moving into the interior work, and afternoons on the groundwork drawings, refining and adjusting as the building revealed, in the way all buildings do once they begin to rise from the ground, the small differences between what you planned and what the site actually requires. Diane came out every 2 weeks to walk the progress with her, and these visits had developed their own rhythm. They would walk the building first, Elena explaining what was happening structurally, and Diane asking questions about how the spaces would function, and then they would sit at the kitchen table and work through the program logistics, the partnership documents, the planning for the first residential cohort. They did not always agree. Diane wanted the main gathering space configured with fixed seating for a presentation mode, and Elena thought fixed seating was an institutional mistake that would limit the space's usefulness to whatever whoever had last used it decided it should be. They argued about this with the specific productive friction of two people who each had professional authority in their own domain, and neither of whom was inclined to concede territory without a real reason. Fixed seating signals to the participants that there is a front of the room, Elena said, at a kitchen table conversation in July. A front of the room means someone has authority and someone else is receiving it. That's not the culture you're trying to build. I know that's not the culture, Diane said. But the reality is that in the first 2 days of any cohort, the participants are nervous, and a room with too much flexibility creates anxiety because nobody knows where to sit. Then you solve the anxiety with facilitation, not architecture. Facilitation has limits. Architecture has a longer memory. Elena looked at her. That's my argument. I know, Diane said. I'm using it against you. They eventually landed on a modular seating system that could be arranged formally or informally, depending on the day's needs, which was both a compromise and, Elena admitted privately, probably a better solution than either of them had originally proposed. This was the kind of outcome that required two people who were both right about different parts of the same problem, and it was also, she reflected, the kind of outcome that only happened when neither person was trying to win more than they were trying to solve it. The building was completed in late May of the following year, 14 months after groundbreaking, on a Thursday that was warmer than average and entirely clear. Howard walked it with Elena on the morning of completion, and he was thorough in the way he was always thorough, checking the structural elements, the window operation, the foundation drainage where the grade shifted near the northeast corner that had been the problem point from the beginning. Everything held, everything performed within the tolerances he had designed for, which was what you wanted from a building and what you could only confirm by standing inside it when it was finished and measuring against what you had intended. It's a good building, Howard said, standing in the main gathering space, with afternoon light coming through the east windows and long horizontal bars across the new wood floor. Yes, Elena said. It was. She could tell the way you can tell when something you have been building toward has arrived at what it was supposed to be. Not relief, exactly, and not pride, though there was some of both. Mostly recognition. The building looked like the drawing had always looked in her head, which was the best thing you could say about a finished structure. Diane brought the first cohort in June. 12 women, selected from the program's wait list. A mix of ages and industries and stages of development, from a 26-year-old building a sustainable textile company to a 58-year-old who had spent 30 years in corporate logistics and was starting her own freight consulting firm. They arrived on a Sunday afternoon with luggage and laptops and varying degrees of visible anxiety, and Diane and her two program staff met them at the door and walked them through the building with the ease of people who had been preparing for this moment for a long time. Elena watched from the main house, from the kitchen window that looked out toward the east lawn. She did not go over. This was Diane's opening, not hers, and she understood the difference between the person who builds the space and the person who runs it. You had to actually maintain that boundary, not just agree to it in a governance document. But she watched, and what she saw was 12 women walking into a building that had been made for them, even though none of them had been consulted in its making, and responding to it the way people respond to spaces that have been designed with genuine intention. They stopped talking when they first came into the main gathering room. Not because it was grand, which it wasn't, because it was right. Because the light and the proportion and the view through the east windows toward the oaks had been thought through by someone who understood that space is not neutral, that the rooms we inhabit make claims on us, and that the right room at the right moment can make a person feel, before a single word of program content has been delivered, that they are somewhere they are supposed to be. Elena went back to her drafting table. She had a new project starting in the fall, a consultation for a community arts building 2 counties east that wanted to expand its education wing. The site had complications she was still working through, a drainage issue on the west side that interacted badly with the proposed footprint, and she had been turning it over in the back of her mind for 2 weeks in the way she always turned problems over when she wasn't ready to draw them yet. She picked up her pencil. She drew the site outline, the existing building, the proposed expansion footprint, and the drainage channel that was the problem. She looked at it for a while. Then she rotated the expansion 90 degrees, which changed everything about the drainage interaction, and also, she noticed immediately, created a much better relationship between the new wing and the existing garden space on the south side of the building. She stared at it for a moment. Sometimes the answer to a problem is not to solve the constraint, but to remove it by changing the question entirely. And the trick was being willing to let go of the original orientation long enough to see whether a different one made more sense. She had known this for 30 years. She still had to relearn it on every project, because the pull toward the original framing was always stronger than it seemed like it should be. She wrote a note in the margin of the drawing. Rotation, check setback on north side. Call Howard. She set it aside and went to make dinner. Grant Holloway's legal challenge had become, by the time the groundwork building opened, a known quantity in the county's legal community. Not famous, not scandal, but known. The way professional missteps are known in small worlds where everyone has overlapping sources. People were not cruel about it, because most people are not actively cruel about the private difficulties of their colleagues. But it was known, and known things have weight, and Grant had spent the intervening months carrying it with a certain deliberate straightforwardness that was, in the end, the only dignified option available to him. He had taken a case in February that he would not have taken a year earlier, a messy property dispute involving a family farm and 3 adult siblings, and a will that had been drafted by someone who should not have been drafting wills, and the kind of tangled emotional history that makes property disputes about everything except the property. He had taken it because the client was the middle sibling, a woman named Greta, who had been managing the farm alone for 7 years, while her brothers pursued careers elsewhere, and who was now being asked by those brothers to sell it. And Grant had looked at her situation and seen something in it that made him unable to say no. He had not examined this impulse closely at the time. He had simply taken the case. He won it in April. Not cleanly. It was a negotiated resolution rather than a full trial, and Greta did not get everything she had hoped for, but she kept the farm, and she kept a workable relationship with at least one of her brothers, which was probably the best that situation was ever going to produce. She cried in his office when he told her the terms, and he handed her a box of tissues and looked out his window and let her have the moment without making it about his performance of having helped her. After she left, Margaret appeared in his doorway. She had been doing this more since his divorce, appearing in doorways with an expression that was not quite checking on him, but was not entirely unrelated to it. Good result, she said. Better than it looked 3 months ago. The will issue was the key, right? Once we established the drafting error, the brothers' position became a lot more expensive to maintain, he said. People settle when it stops being worth it. The numbers shifted. You like this kind of case, Margaret said. It was not a question. Grant considered it. I like cases where the person who did the actual work gets to keep it, he said. Margaret looked at him for a moment with the specific expression she had when she was choosing not to say something. Then she said, There's a family estate matter that came in last week. I was going to send it to Patel, but I think you might want to look at it first. Send it over. She left, and Grant turned back to his window, and the city moved below him with its ordinary weekday motion, and he thought about Greta and the farm, and the 7 years she had managed it alone, and the brothers who had returned when there was something to claim. and he thought about the way certain patterns repeat themselves across human situations with a consistency that has nothing to do with coincidence and everything to do with what people believe they are entitled to simply by proximity. He had been one of those people. He knew this now with the complete clarity that only arrives after you have stopped arguing about it with yourself. He had lived alongside Elena's work and called it a shared life and believed, without ever examining the belief, that living alongside something entitled you to it. That presence was the same as contribution, that comfort was the same as creation. It was not a malicious belief. He had not intended harm, but intention and impact were different things, and he had been in the law long enough to know that courts do not typically award points for good intentions. He had learned this about himself in the hardest way available, which was having the records laid out in front of him in a conference room and finding that they did not say what he had assumed they would say. The records had said something else entirely. They had said, here is what was built, here is when it was built, here is whose name is on it, here is the account from which every significant payment was drawn. And what they had not said, what no record anywhere said, was his name. He had not built the life he lived in. He had lived in it. That was what he had done, for 20 years. And the distinction was not a small one. Well, Elena did not think about Grant often. This was not a deliberate suppression. She had not told herself not to think about him, had not built a wall between herself and the 20 years they had shared or the wreckage of the divorce or the legal proceedings. She had simply found, over the course of the year and a half since he had left, that the thoughts arrived less frequently and with less weight each time they came, the way something gradually loses volume when you stop feeding it. What she thought about, most of the time, was work. The groundwork building, which was into its second month of operation and producing, according to Diane, outcomes that were exceeding the program's previous metrics in ways that Diane was cautiously reluctant to fully attribute to the residential format, but was clearly attributing to the residential format. The arts building expansion, which had broken ground in October with the rotated footprint that solved the drainage problem and which Howard was managing with his usual meticulous precision. A third consultation she had taken on for a private client who wanted a small residence on a difficult coastal site, the kind of site that made most architects nervous, and that Elena found genuinely interesting because the constraint was the design problem, and the design problem was the thing she was best at. She was also, in a quieter parallel track, beginning to think about the investment portfolio in a different way. Not changing it. It was performing well, and she was not a person who changed things that were performing well without reason, but considering what she wanted it to eventually become. She had spent 30 years building it for herself, which had been the correct and necessary project for 30 years. It was becoming clear to her, slowly and without drama, that the next chapter of it might have a different orientation. Not charity, exactly. Something more structural. A fund, perhaps. Capital for the kind of women she was watching move through Diane's program. Serious people doing serious work who needed something more than encouragement and slightly more patient capital than the conventional funding structures were designed to provide. She mentioned this to Diane at a kitchen table conversation in September, framing it carefully as an early idea rather than a plan, because it was still an early idea. Diane set down her coffee cup. How early? She said. Early enough that I don't have documentation, Elena said, but you're thinking about a fund structure. I'm thinking about a fund structure. Diane was quiet for a moment. Elena, I have 40 women in the current program year. 31 of them have a viable business model and a real capacity to execute. 22 of them are going to hit a capital wall within the next 18 months that has nothing to do with their competence and everything to do with the way early-stage funding works. I know. I have been trying to solve that problem for 4 years, Diane said. I have talked to every foundation and every family office and every impact investor in a 3-state radius, and what I consistently get is interest without commitment, which is the funding world's version of telling you your work is valuable without actually valuing it. Elena looked at her. I'm not asking you to make a decision today, Diane said. I'm asking you to make it before you change your mind. Elena almost smiled. I don't change my mind once I've started drawing. Then start drawing. It was not a simple process, and Elena did not pretend it was. Setting up a fund structure required legal architecture that was considerably more complex than any building she had designed, and she spent 4 months working with a financial attorney named James Okafor, who had the specific temperament she needed, someone who understood that she was not asking him to make decisions, but to build her the legal structure to make her own. They had 3 conversations where they disagreed substantially and resolved it each time by going back to the foundational question, which was, what is this actually for, and what does that require? The answer to the first question was always the same. The answer to the second evolved as they worked through the specifics. The Brooks Capital Seed Fund was formally established in December, capitalized with a portion of Elena's portfolio that was substantial enough to be meaningful and structured with a governance model that reflected everything she had learned over 30 years about the difference between money that helps and money that controls. Investment decisions would be made by a 3-person committee: Elena, Diane, and a third member with a financial background whom they spent 6 weeks identifying and eventually found in a woman named Vera Moss, who had spent 20 years in venture capital and had left it, as she told Elena at their first meeting, because she was tired of funding confidence and wanted to start funding competence. Those are different things, Elena said. Dramatically different, Vera said. Confidence is loud and easy to see. Competence is quiet and requires you to actually look. Elena hired her. The news about the fund reached the Bar Association event circuit, the way all such news did, filtered through the particular distortions of professional gossip, inflated in scale, imprecise about the structure, correct about the basic fact, which was that Elena Brooks had established a seed fund for women entrepreneurs that was being run in partnership with Diane Sutherland's program and capitalized at a level that made it a genuine resource rather than a symbolic gesture. Grant heard about it in January from a colleague at a firm dinner, the same kind of sideways social delivery as the news about groundwork the year before. He received it the same way, without visible reaction, attentive to the conversation, carrying it home with him afterward. He sat in his front room, which he had repainted properly in November with painter's tape and better technique, the color a warm gray that worked better with the light than the blue had. He had bought 2 more chairs and a decent lamp, and the room had become the place he actually spent his evenings rather than just passing through it, which was a small domestic fact that had taken him an unreasonably long time to achieve. He thought about Elena and the fund and the building and the program, and he thought about what it meant that all of this had been happening, was continuing to happen, in the life of a woman who had spent 20 years in his peripheral vision. He had known she was capable. He had known she was intelligent. What he had not known, what he had, through consistent incuriosity, declined to know, was the scale of what that capability was doing when it was not in his peripheral vision, when it was simply operating, steadily and without his awareness, in the parts of her life that he had never thought to ask about. The fund, the building, the consulting practice, the portfolio. All of it had been there. All of it had been happening across 20 years of a shared life in which he had come home to the lake house she owned and eaten at the table she had chosen and looked out at the lake she had bought the view of at 28, and he had called it home, which it was, for him, the way a place becomes home when you live in it long enough, regardless of whose name is on the deed. He had loved her, in the incomplete way he had understood love at the time, as the presence of someone who made his life function, who provided the texture of partnership without demanding that he actually see her. That was not a kind thing to have done to someone. He knew this now. He had known it for a while, but January was the first time he said it, plainly and without softening, inside his own head, without the cushion of justification or the comparative arguments he had used in the early months to make his behavior seem more understandable. He had not seen her. He had lived with her for 20 years, and he had not seen her, and she had known it, and she had stayed until she had understood that staying was no longer a choice she was willing to make. And then she had prepared, quietly and with complete precision, and she had waited for him to make the first move because she was a woman who understood that the best position is the one you occupy when the other person thinks they are the one acting. He owed her an apology. He knew this with the same clarity he brought to his best legal work, unambiguous, documented in the evidence, not subject to reasonable dispute. He also knew that an apology, at this point, served primarily his own need to have made it, rather than any need she had to receive it. Elena was not sitting in her lake house waiting for Grant Holloway to understand what he had done. She was building a fund and running a program and designing a coastal residence and doing all of it with the same focused, patient competence that had been operating alongside his life for 2 decades while he hadn't been paying attention. The apology would not give her anything she did not already have. And the recognition of this, The clear-eyed understanding that your remorse is real and also irrelevant to the person who has already moved past the need for it was perhaps the most honest and difficult position he had arrived at through the whole of this experience. He could be sorry. He was sorry. He would carry the specific shape of what he had failed to do with him, not as punishment, but as information. The kind of information that changes how you move through subsequent rooms, how you ask questions, how you stay curious about the people you choose to stand beside. He got up and turned off the lamp and went to bed in his rented house. It was his house now. He had bought it in the fall, the badly painted, then properly repainted front room, and the tree in the yard he now knew was a linden. And he lay in the dark and thought about nothing in particular, and eventually he slept. The thing about building something real is that it does not announce itself as finished. It simply becomes more itself over time, more settled in its function, more clearly what it was always intended to be. The groundwork building was like this, better in its second season than its first, because the program had learned from the first cohort how the spaces actually worked versus how they had been theorized to work. And those small corrections had accumulated into something that was now operating with a confidence the building itself seemed to have absorbed. Elena walked through it on a Tuesday morning in February, a year and a half after opening, when no program was in session and the building was quiet. She had a key, which she rarely used because she was disciplined about the boundary between property owner and program partner. But she had come to check on a water pressure issue in the residential wing that Marcus had flagged. And she walked through the rest of the building while she was there because it was her building and she was allowed to be in it. The main gathering space in the morning light was different from how it looked during a session. Emptier, obviously, but also more apparent. The structural logic was visible when the room was unoccupied. The way the light moved from the east windows. The relationship between the ceiling height and the acoustic quality, which she had spent considerable effort getting right, and which still, a year later, gave her a specific satisfaction when she noticed it working. The modular seating stacked against one wall, waiting to be configured into whatever the next session needed it to be. She stood in the room for a few minutes. She had been in many buildings over the course of her career. Some she had designed, some she had consulted on, many she had simply visited or studied. The ones she remembered best were not always the most impressive. They were the ones where you could feel, standing inside them, that someone had been genuinely thinking, not about how the building would look in photographs, but about what it would feel like to be a person inside it, on an ordinary Tuesday, trying to do something that mattered. This building felt like that. She knew it with the combination of professional judgment and something that was not professional judgment, but that she had stopped trying to separate from it, because the two had been working together for long enough that distinguishing them was no longer useful. She fixed the water pressure issue, which turned out to be a partially closed valve rather than anything structural, and she locked the building and walked back across the east lawn toward the main house, the February air cold and clean on her face, the lake visible through the bare winter trees in the same gray-blue it always was, the birch trees at the gate standing white and patient at the end of the drive. Priya, the young woman from the first cohort who had been 18 months into planning her material sourcing company and couldn't start, had started. She had called Elena in October to tell her because she had apparently decided that Elena was the person she wanted to tell first, which Elena had found unexpectedly moving. The company had made its first sale in November. Small, Priya had said on the phone. We're talking about one transaction, but real. Real, Elena had said, is the only kind that matters. She went inside and made tea and sat at the kitchen table where she had sat through 20 years of marriage and 6 months of divorce proceedings and 14 months of construction and 2 seasons of a program that was changing the shape of what the next decade of her life was going to look like. The table was an old one, oak, that had been in the house since before she bought it, left by the previous owners and so well made that she had never seen a reason to replace it. She had refinished it herself, 12 years ago, during a weekend in November when Grant had been at a conference. She had sanded it by hand and applied 3 coats of oil finish, which had taken 2 full days and left her hands smelling like linseed for a week. Nobody had noticed the difference except her, and she had not mentioned it to anyone, and the table was still there, exactly as it had been when she finished it, solid, warm-toned, entirely unremarkable, unless you knew what you were looking at. This was, she thought, an accurate description of most of the things she had built. They did not announce themselves. They did not require acknowledgement to remain standing. They simply were what they were, solid in their foundations, designed to outlast the particular weather of any given season. She drank her tea. Outside, the lake held its winter color, and the birch trees stood in the pale February light, and the building on the east lawn was quiet and waiting for the next cohort, and the gate at the end of the drive was locked against the county road, in the same way it had been locked against it for a year and a half. Not out of bitterness, not out of triumph, but simply because it was hers, and she had decided who came through it and who did not, which was the most basic and honest form of ownership there is. There is a kind of woman that the world consistently underestimates. She is not the loudest person in the room. She does not chase the credit for what she builds or require that the people around her understand its value before she continues building. She is patient in the way that structures are patient, carrying load invisibly, distributing weight across a foundation that nobody sees because it is underground, doing the work that makes everything above it possible without ever demanding that anyone come look at what is holding it up. The world tends to interpret this patience as passivity. It is not passivity. It is the specific discipline of someone who knows that a thing built correctly will still be standing long after the argument about whether it could be built is finished. Elena Brooks had known this about herself since she was 25 years old, standing in a small studio apartment with a sander in her hand and sawdust on her shirt, refinishing a floor that nobody would ever know she had refinished herself. She had carried it through 30 years of professional work, through a marriage that did not see it, through a divorce that tried to challenge it, through a legal process that ultimately had no choice but to confirm what the records had always said. She had not needed revenge. Revenge was for people who needed the other person to understand what they had done, and Elena had long since stopped requiring Grant Holloway's understanding of anything. What she had needed, what she had built, deliberately and without drama, over the course of a very long time, was the life she actually wanted to live. She was living it. She set down her tea, picked up her pencil, and went back to work.